if that is being shaped before you even get in there, how can you possibly have, I mean, it gets into this age-old question about free will and a whole bunch of other.
That if you have looked at a certain item and you've kept it in for a certain amount of time, then the probability that you're going to get it goes up, right? So they go ahead and ship it. And then they also say, well, most people who got that also got the spoon to go with it. So they go ahead and ship the spoon just in case. And I was like, wow, that's kind of it's interesting. It's great because then it can get to me faster. But it's also kind of scary because it's like, maybe now they just start sending me stuff that I'm like, oh, and I pay for it because I'm probably going to get it anyways. And it's just, it kind of takes away this idea that I do have free will and you can't predict what I'm going to do.
And we're back. Another episode of Life in Bomb City Podcast. I'm Aaron Faber.
I'm Dr. Beth Rodriguez. And
we're coming to you here live from Amarillo. And we are going to visit today about
critical thinking.
Yeah.
So I think it really hits with a lot of topics we've been talking about anyways.
Exactly.
And I think it really lends itself to so many different topics and so many different subjects that we can talk about. So I think it's a good one to kind of delve into at this time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different things going on. I think a couple of days ago, I guess we were talking the other morning, we were walking in, what our topic was going to be.
Yeah.
And we decided that the fact that, there's so many different stories out there, and of course, so much information about not just mainstream media and it's not about just the media. It's a larger thing about, whether or not people are really processing the information that they're receiving, or if they're just kind of taking it at face value, maybe even not even reading some of the stuff, or maybe just relying on people to kind of give it to them, however, give that information to them, however they are going to use it for a day. Like a single-use news.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Instead of a long-term critical...
I feel like that's what it is now, right? We talk about all the time, clickbait. And, if it's the title, it's just a title of something and you click on it because it looks interesting or, it's something controversial. And then it turns out that if you really do read it, it may have nothing to do with it, or it may just be like a very small part just so you click on it. I really am trying to get people to be more critical about their thinking, because I feel like we just take a lot of things at face value.
Right.
We hear something and we're like, oh, it's the truth. And we haven't even looked into it. I think people's lives can be ruined. I was joking, and it's funny because I don't really watch a lot of stuff, but sometimes I just, like my guilty pleasures are just sitting there waiting until I have to go. I have like 30 minutes until I have to pick up my daughter. So I always turn on Catfish.
What is that?
Oh, it's on MTV. Okay. And it all comes because there's one guy, his name's Nev. Neve, not Nev.
I'm so old. I didn't even know that MTV, I'm sure that MTV has been on for forever. But I mean, I know that, get it. But I don't watch MTV anymore. Yeah. I used to watch it all the time.
Because they had videos, but now they don't do videos. Now it's all like shows and contests and stuff.
Yeah.
But this one, you should maybe watch it. It's kind of good. So what happened, the reason it happened was because he was talking to somebody online for a very long time, and they had posted pictures of somebody that wasn't really who it was. And so he thought he was having online relationship with somebody that he wasn't. So now what he does is he has this TV show on MTV, and he does that. Okay. So,
and that happened to that football player? I mean, isn't there a football player that happened to?
It happened to there's a basketball player. This is what I was going to tell you. This is what, it's on face value. And everybody just took it and ran with it. And now his life is pretty much ruined. Right. So his name, Chris Anderson. He's Birdman from the Nuggets.
Okay.
Right. He was the one with the tattoos everywhere.
Right.
Well, he first had a bad, I guess, I don't know, people just had this idea about him, a bad stereotype of him, just because of the way he looked. So he worked really hard to make sure that didn't happen. Well, this one girl, they ended up talking. Well, it turns out that she was They were talking, but they was going through a third party. So this other person, who the catfish, was getting all their emails and all of their texts and all their pictures and all this stuff. Well, the girl that he was talking to, he didn't know that she was only 17. She told him she was 18. And anyways, the catfish person ended up saying that they were going to release the pictures of the girl who's 17 that happened to be a little bit, which you probably shouldn't be sending over your phone, but she did it. And so they did release. Well, her mother found out and they called the cops. And so immediately they went to this guy's house and he's now labeled as a pedophile.
Wow.
Okay. So his life was ruined, but they didn't really know all the information. I think that's kind of what happens now. It's like, things happen, like something happens. It's really like, oh, it's a big deal. So everybody hears about it. The media hears about it. The news hears, and they make a big, huge deal out about it. But then they found out that it wasn't true, and there wasn't that big of a media like recant of that information. You know, it was like, oh, front page pedophile. 10th page, oh, it wasn't really real.
Right.
But it's too late now, right? And that's the idea. I think that if we critically think about information, if we see something that sounds interesting, instead of just saying, oh, that's the truth, we should say, okay, well, you know, that's one possibility. Let's look into this.
Right.
And that's where I think critically thinking has become kind of like a backseat kind of ability. Like we feel like we don't need to, because why? Because they're just giving us everything.
Right. And I mean, kind of like single use information.
Yeah.
I remember the scene, the movie Fight Club. I mean, that's my early adult movie range, I guess.
Okay.
And I guess was it Edward Norton? Mm-hmm. His character in there is talking about all the different varieties of single use things that he's going through, particularly as he travels pretty much for his job.
Yeah.
And I mean, how empty, really, what I gathered from that, I think the point was that his life was fairly empty.
Yeah, where's the meaning?
There's a single usedness for just about everything. Uh-huh. And I thought that was always something, a place that I go. I have an example of federalism that I always use. That's a single use federalism, because I think in Oregon there's some type of a state law that has to do with, is it part of the decriminalizing of drugs movement, specifically targeting around like harder drugs that are for folks that are addicted to harder drugs like heroin or something else, who are getting the need to get treatment, right? So that they don't have also the complications, I suppose, of a legal entanglement as well. Although, I mean, it's still criminal. It's just decriminalized, or it's still not legal. That's what I'm saying. It's just decriminalized, and I mean, it's only for single use stuff, because if there's any more than, and I don't know exactly what the amounts are, but if it's any more than that, then obviously they've got a different type of problem on their hands, because they have, I guess, maybe intention to distribute and doing other things and selling, and I mean, who knows? But I mean, my point is that that's a wholly type of different federalism, because in the United States, that's still illegal. Yeah. And I mean, arguably is a really big target in the United States for, I mean, especially right now, with everything going on, that's something that's being, but in the United States and the United States government and the state of Oregon have an agreement, right? Where they want to recognize and make sure that they hold up in respect and hold in confidence the laws that are passed by the people of Oregon, and make sure that so my point is that is a really good, it's a good indication of like just how often we hear that term. We almost associate it with just about anything. If you can talk about it in terms of federalism, my goodness, it's like, it sounds about as boring as you can get. But you get to something like that where, you know, you have an issue with a specifically a topic or a label that moves the needle, and it becomes something else altogether. I think that one of the most recent examples in politics was the Matt Gaetz fiasco over the last really 3 or 4 years. Face it, 6 years probably. The whole time that he was in the House of Representatives, and of course, I think he's on his own. He's got his own TV show now, right? But that's not really what this is. It's not meant to target that, but rather how it can be used to shape a story to fit a narrative rather than looking for the truth.
Right.
And maybe that's what critical thinking is about, is searching for a truth rather than just a quick satisfaction.
Absolutely. I feel like when we don't critically think, we just expect an answer. And I'm really I think that our classes really lend us to be able to let our students have that critical thinking aspect where we don't necessarily have the answer. Psychology doesn't necessarily have the answer, right? When people say, oh, well, this person has a tendency, and it's like, well, yeah, maybe there's an average of people. There's a tendency for people who grow up in abusive homes to also be abusive, but it doesn't mean that everybody is. So there's always a relative. There's always a possible different way of looking at it. And I think that brings up the critical thinking. Like what could lend somebody to continue that cycle of violence? Like, what is it that lends into it? But that's what's even more important. What are the things and the factors that lend to it not happening? Because it doesn't always happen. So what can we do as a manipulation, which I guess it shouldn't be a manipulation, I guess something to stand in, to make it not happen. Like, what is that? And that's where the critical thinking comes in.
Like, how do you intervene? Is that what you mean, like an intervention?
Yes. And that's what I know. I'm just experimental. So I always say manipulation, which people hear that and they're like, oh, no, you're manipulating people. But that's the idea. It's like the treatment. Like, what treatment can we do so it doesn't happen? And that's the idea. It's like, even if we did have the treatment, is that going to guarantee that it's going to work? No.
Sure.
And so there's no absolutes. And I think that's what really pushes forward that idea of critical thinking. And I think that's where we should be more often. Yeah. Okay. Even with AI, we've been talking about AI, and I think there still should be, even though you may get the answer from AI, you still critically think about it. Like, where did AI get that answer? And is it right? And is there other possibilities? And you can ask AI, like, how right are you? And I mean, things like those questions. And sometimes if there's not a real answer and that can give you a probability, then you probably should be looking at other places. You should look at other sources. You should try to figure out, is there a different perspective? Or am I just looking at this one perspective of this one person that has been putting it out so they can control the narrative of the story?
Right.
In history, right, government and history, there's been so many people who have had that ability to shut out all other perspectives and only, to certain people show their perspective. And we've seen a lot of people get in trouble, like their follower people get in trouble and do things that they never would have done.
Right.
Like Jonestown.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a cult, and he just cut off all other communication. You can't talk to people. If you do, then, something's wrong. And it's a constant, like, this is my perspective. This is my point of view. This is the only way to look at it. And then he talked them into killing themselves. Like, what? And where did that come from? So, right, again, that has to do with what you need to critically think for yourself. You should question things. I'm not saying like you should always be like, damn the man, that's not what I'm saying. But at the same time,
no, damn the man. Save the empire. That's, the whole
exactly.
I joke around about that all the time.
But if you have if you're having a question, then question. Look, don't second guess yourself. There's always a reason why you feel that way. And that's another thing. I think we've talked about it before. I think that we should listen to our emotions more often. Like, your emotions are a survival thing. And if you feel anxiety or something's wrong, you're probably right. But a lot of times we just ignore it. It's like, oh, I don't know. They already said this. But the truth is, question it. Ask. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is that if they're right, you're wrong. So what? At least you're doing that critical thinking, trying to see the different perspective and understand that there are different things that are happening here. It's not always just what you see.
Right. And experience drives that to some extent. And but where the limitation comes in, for example, in the news on, I think this last weekend, there's a Chinese artificial intelligence model that was in the news called DeepSeek. And DeepSeek immediately made all kinds of headlines, and the news jumped on it over the weekend, basically. And immediately, without really spending a lot of time talking about, what made it different and why it was able to do some of the things that it was able to do over the weekend, was called into question the billions and billions of dollars of investment into the U.S. AI models. And I mean, of course, there's plenty of room for competition. But I mean, they've been building their reputation, telling the stories of how they're doing their methodologies, and really quite open for the most part. I mean, these algorithms and what they're trying to talk to the people, because again, the type of government that we have, an open government with plenty of checks and balances and levels of accountability and degrees of separation of powers, and we have also the need for private capital within fueling those industries. And in an open government, that means that they need policies that are favorable to those business conditions and a whole bunch of other things. Which requires all of this teamwork.
Absolutely.
And yet, when there was a different, they couldn't wait to jump on the story, and they didn't want to sit on it because it could risk. Right.
You want to get the scoop.
Right.
That's it. You want to get the scoop.
There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a little bit. I think that it's less efficient in the long run.
It is.
And it does a disservice to people who are invested in other ideas.
Absolutely.
That may be long-term ideas. And now, I mean, yesterday, I think the CEO of ChatGPT, Sam Altman, had come out and had mentioned that they have evidence that the DeepSeek had used the data from ChatGPT, which is a violation of its terms of service. And I mean, it's not illegal, but it is a violation of their terms of service, which means that it would have been they would have gotten that information to DeepSeek, that is, would have gotten that information in a way that was not transparent, and it didn't have consent.
Right.
When else would we have ever put a story out there where we hailed the story of the person that didn't have consent?
Right.
That is something that
was violating rules.
And objectively not objective. So anyway, now there's conversations about this third party, NVIDIA, that makes these computer chips, that it affected them in a kind of not just a disproportionate way, because they had one of the reliances that DeepSeek had put on there was that they were relying on these chips that were older, but because it's a Chinese company. The Chinese government is not a democratic open government. They are a communist government, meaning they don't believe in private property ownership.
Right.
Okay. So that's a kind of a disturbing problem for somebody. If you're going to have anybody mess with private investment, I would think that the least credible people would be somebody who doesn't necessarily believe in any private property, certainly doesn't have the safeguards that a Western common law country does.
Right. And I mean, and it did. That one clickbait type information where they wanted to scoop, they wanted to get the information out there. They just didn't know all of it. And it did affect that company, right? Didn't their stocks go down? I mean, all sorts of stuff. People were like, oh gosh, we're not going to. And the truth is they didn't know the whole story. And I think that's the issue. I think a lot of times with social media, you find something out and you want to post it. You want people to have information. I think that's great. We are definitely in this information society where information can be spread and it can be spread quickly. My problem is sometimes that information isn't correct. And we don't take time to really look and delineate between what we see and what is real. What other information do we have out there? What else do we see? And what's really even, I think, is even a little bit scarier is that even all of our search engines and stuff like Google, they will, tailor their stories and what you find to more of your perspective anyways. So if you constantly search one perspective or one type of story, then when you search something else, the ones that are like it will show up. So it's almost like it's without you having to do it, it is confirming your confirmation bias, right? It is showing you other evidence that supports what you are looking at, which, I mean, it's smart because, that's probably what you want to look at, but it does often hinder looking at the other side. Having that objective information to see that maybe there is something different. Maybe that this is not the full story and I can actually sit and think and, get different perspectives to then make my own instead of somebody just telling me what it is and how it's going to be.
It reminds me of the conversation about Minority Report. You don't have the full story. You're relying on predictability or predictive in this way, I guess predictive analytics, is that what it's called? And I think we mentioned the guy that came and spoke with us at ACES this year had mentioned that Amazon takes products and ships them to Amarillo before folks in Amarillo have even purchased the products yet, because their predictive analytics are so good and they're so accurate with predicting human behavior. And maybe we're just that predictable, but every now and then, we change things up, and sometimes we would make different choices if we realized there was a different choice. And if like you're saying, it's shaped, if our decisions are shaped by the not just what we're viewing right in the news feed, but also what the people specifically around us are viewing, and it becomes true. And this may not be correct, because I'm not an AI guru or anything, but it may not be wholly correct. But if that is being shaped before you even get in there, how can you possibly have, it gets into this age-old question about free will and a whole bunch of other stuff with, whether or not you have options to buy other things, which kind of brings into question the whole idea of or monopoly. Yeah. At what point does the future have a monopoly over the present in some ways? And that's kind of the question of Minority Report. Sure.
It's a question of so many things. Yeah. I was really surprised about the whole Amazon thing, but it makes a lot of sense, right? He was saying that if you have looked at a certain item and you've kept it in for a certain amount of time, then the probability that you're going to get it goes up, right? So they go ahead and ship it. And then they also say, well, most people who got that also got the spoon to go with it. So they go ahead and ship the spoon just in case. And I was like, wow, it's interesting. It's great because then it can get to me faster, but it's also kind of scary because it's like, maybe now they just start sending me stuff that I'm like, oh, and I pay for it because I'm probably going to get it anyways. And it's just, it kind of takes away this idea that I do have free will and you can't predict what I'm going to do, but maybe we are very predictable.
I think so. And there's really not anything, I guess, in terms of precedent different from doing the shipping beforehand from them being putting right next to the register, somebody putting like some candy next to the register because they know that when you're leaving, you're probably going to want a snack or something. And
sure,
just what is it? I'm already spending this much. I'm going to spend 70 more cents. I'll spend 70 more cents and go ahead and get the Kit Kat or whatever.
Sure.
Or those magazines, that have they're clearly not real, like Elvis Becomes a Bat or something.
Yeah.
Those types of things.
Yeah.
It makes it all the more obvious. You're just upselling at that point, and there's nothing necessarily immoral about having having the consumer at the forefront of your mind. Like, I'm going to take care of this person. That's hospitable in some environments where you're going to take care of them before they have even realized they need to be taken care of. But if they didn't ask for it, in certain avenues, and as we're kind of talking about here, this catfish example that you're mentioning, it kind of changes the outcome though, because this is somebody's life. It's different than a product, and it's different from people going through a line, having to wait for something. It's somebody's life.
Sure. Yeah. And I do. It's critical thinking. I just think that it just allows for that. And I think that we're lucky. We really are. If you think about it, like there's a lot of classes where you just have the answer, and sure, there's some, definite answers and like definitions for everything. But when it comes to the use and the reliability and the, how it's relative to everyday life, we have the ability to really show them that, it is relative, and you do have some free choice and you do have the free will to do things. However, there is a tendency. And I think that's where a lot of people feel like they lose it, or that is the answer. Because when we say on average, people are, well, that's not everybody, right? Not everybody is. There's a statistic. What is it? On average, men have more testosterone than females. Well, yeah, they do. Okay. But does that mean that all women don't have testosterone? No. Yeah, that's silly, right? We do have different levels on that, and so we don't have a definite on anything, Right. Everybody's hormones, everybody's neurotransmitters, they're all different. It is individually based. And so I can't answer the question because there's so many different variables that are in there.
Right. It's a really good thing to bring up too, because just I think yesterday we were visiting in one of my classes, we mentioned that, absolutes in government really, if government's a reflection of the will of people, and people's will changes over time, majority policies change over time. And if you zoom out enough and look over a long enough term, you realize that there are absolute universal rights, but the way that we perceive them also changes how we enforce the rights and protect them. And so, sometimes history has shown that it expands our understanding and interpretation of those rights, and sometimes it restricts it.
Sure.
Depending on the situation, like World War I, for example, there's a really great Supreme Court case that it's a First Amendment case from 1917, 1918. It has to do with the Selective Service Act. At that time, the Woodrow Wilson administration had signed into law. And of course, we needed Americans needed to be out serving their country in World War I. Terrible, awful thing to have to do, but they needed it. The state needed them to be there.
Sure.
A first-generation immigrant challenged it by going out and trying to prevent people, or not prevent people, but persuading them not to go in for selective service or to the draft. And he had a pamphlet that he was passing out, and the pamphlet was an interesting twist on the 13th Amendment, the 14th, and the 15th. The 13th Amendment being that involuntary servitude, that was illegal. And you're not allowed to have involuntary servitude. And yet, here the government is asking for involuntary servitude in the military. And it was for a first-generation immigrant to have that, in my opinion, kind of a legal sophistication there, was probably a little disheartening, but it was also kind of an ignorant perspective from the government's perspective. One thing that they argued was that that what he didn't realize was that the national need sometimes trumps the individual need for rights. And even under the Bill of Rights, we have lots of examples of that happening again and again, and over a long period of time, including during the Civil War. Any major conflict is a major place where the state is looking for its own interests. And I think if we were to think about and draw back again, right now, the things that people have anxiety about from a critical thinking perspective, with regard to what the current Trump administration is going forward with. Yesterday, I think that they made some news with an extra piece of information that came through about this spending freeze that's been enacted by an executive order. And one of the big questions there is whether or not, for example, not just DEI, but problems that more generally face social sciences in governments, not just the U.S. government, but in governments all around the world, including our allies. I think one was in New Zealand, where their government has kind of tried to shut off some of the funding for what it considers to be "quote unquote" soft science, and that's what I read. I had to read it a couple more times because I've never heard social science called soft science. Because what they wanted was, they're trying to incentivize economic gain, because obviously they're spurring competition. There's a lot going on in the world, and they're saying there's less value right now. What I hear is echoes of John F. Kennedy. I hear echoes of his inauguration when he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Now, I know that on one hand, as with social sciences, it's definitely within our interest range to be worried or consider anxiety about, there being a cut in any type of funding to social sciences. But that's not. I don't think that that's what they're saying by cutting that free, or by preventing some of that money. And they haven't done this for social sciences yet. But it's just a concern that I read about in the news. And one thing that there's mention in, though, in that news story is that spending freeze doesn't necessarily mean that there's not programs that are going to be funded.
Right.
It doesn't mean across the board, but rather what we want y'all to do, and what I hear is incentivizing, which is no different than the government's ever done.
Right.
Incentivizing, they want people to have value in their society and not feel like their value is to feel alien, and that should be rewarded over a long period of time, making people less unified, making people more divided, and studies that prove that they're more divided doesn't necessarily help the national imperative of competition across the world. I can understand what they were trying to say, and I can also appreciate the fact that it's hard to get there because we have all these other layers of that.
Right. And it is like, if we try to look at the big picture, everybody does, if we can't help it, everybody's a little selfish and they want to do their thing and they can't always look for the big picture, what we can do for our country. We're more looking at what can be done for us. And that is, I think that it has to do with our culture, but I also feel like it has to do with the upbringing. We see it a lot with the changes in patriotism. You know how it is. It's like, I'm not doing that kind of thing, where a lot of people, that's part of who they are. Of course I'm doing that for my country because I have that need, that drive, that want to do that. But a lot of times we don't. At the same time, it could be helpful for the individual, but we just see it as a detrimental to the individual, even though we're not looking at the big picture. Okay, because it's a perspective you look at it from, right? The information that you're getting. And if you decide that, from my perspective, it's not beneficial for me, okay, but because I'm looking only on the individual, and I could die, I could lose a leg, I could, whatever's happening, right? But if I look at it as the whole, right, it's like, well, I'm doing it for my country, which could also benefit me. And not just me, but my neighbor and this person that I don't even know.
Children.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard to do that.
Right.
Again, and you have to take that perspective. You have to look at multiple perspectives so that you can critically think about the decisions, about what it is. When we talk about serving in general. I have a really intelligent student. She's, pushing all the different boxes on trying to make you think of it a different way. And she brought that up. She was like, I really think that the world needs to be more about a community. We all need to be serving. And I think where people turn into poverty or turn to bad things is because they forgot that we're part of a community, and we become a lot more individualistic, where we're like, oh no, it's about me. It's about me, instead of understanding that it's not just about you, but it's about everybody. And if we had that community type idea, then we wouldn't have that, which community type idea definitely has to take in all the perspectives and leads to more critical thinking, where you aren't in that absolute of right and wrong. Right.
And being able to do some of that in empathizing, but it has to do with reading and to some extent just observing, being a good, trying to be as objective in your observations as possible, and totally failing along the way.
Absolutely.
But getting better at it. Hopefully as you go. Being able to understand the history, particularly in social sciences, is a key here. I think to remember back to, for example, the 1960s, a reference there to the Kennedy administration, the inauguration and the speech and all those other things. Specifically, that there's a Cold War going on. There's an overall perception in the American public that the American time is kind of passing because they are falling behind in the missile race. Even though at the time we had a massive lead, we had no idea at the time that we had a massive lead. There are a combination of things, that there's a perception behind that we're falling behind in space, and that we're not doing everything that we can do. And so if you listen to what Kennedy is saying in that inaugural speech, you can kind of hear certain tones that sound very similar to what you can hear out of the administration today.
Yeah.
And yet that comparison will draw lots of ire, no doubt, from people all over the place, because John F. Kennedy's a Democrat. What could he possibly have in common with Donald Trump, who's a Republican?
Yeah. And that's what's funny too, is that people in different groups usually have more in common. And the idea is if we have the same goal, then we're going to have there's going to be things that are similar. So the common goal is to make everything better for everybody. Like both of them wanted to, right? So therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that they would have similarities in things that they're saying.
Right.
Yeah, I think the whole space race thing, I think that's what lends itself to the conspiracy that we never landed on the moon. in 1969, that we didn't do it, but we pretended we did so that we could be ahead of. And I think that just brings about all this whole idea of like, well, go ahead and critically think about it. I love that you're going to do that, because if you have questions, then question it. And does it make sense? And that's why people believe it, is because it could make sense. It's a possibility that might work, that might have been the reason. And maybe, and I don't have a problem with those. I like people who ask questions. And I think that makes it so much better. I did see, I don't feel like we talked about this, but I did see that there was a really big proponent for the guy who was saying that, about the idea that there's a flat earth. Did you see that?
Was he a rapper?
I don't know. I don't know what he did. I just know that he was very adamant. And so he decided to do, I think it was I don't know if it was Facebook Live or YouTube, but he went he's like, I'm going to go to the edge of the earth and that's where I'm going to be. And I'll be able to see that there's nothing there. And he got there and he's like, you know what? I was wrong. The earth is round. I can see it. Like, I am standing here and I can see that it doesn't just fall off. It's round. And he said, so, I had all this support, and he was like, it's flat and da,
Is it
da,
a
da.
YouTuber?
I think so. I think it was. And he
That's
finally said, you know what? I was wrong. And I think that's huge, right?
Yeah.
Because he wasn't. He was adamant. It is flat, and I have all this. I have so much support. I have all these things that make sense. And then he got there, and he was like, oops.
What an awesome thing, though. It takes a lot of courage to be able to get up there and say, after you've said all these things, to get up there and say, you know what, I am wrong about this.
Yeah.
I've got to change because the evidence has led me in a different direction.
Absolutely.
And of course, that's exactly what we should be doing. We wouldn't go to a doctor if the doctor, you walk in and you say, you know what, you look like you've got a headache. You must have a tumor in your head.
Yeah.
Well, that seems like a jump, right? It sounds like, but on the other hand, you might, I suppose. So maybe you should go, maybe they'll order you to go get tested, but hopefully they won't jump immediately to the conclusion and then not even try to test.
Right. And not even talk to you, not even look, not even do, right. And that's the idea. They're critically thinking. Now, do they have heuristics where they go, it's probably this? Sure. But when that doesn't work, they don't just say, oh, yeah, that's it. They keep going. They critically think and say, okay, well, let's do something else. Let's look somewhere else. Let's find something else.
Right.
And I think that's what we all need to do.
Right. Follow the evidence, right?
Right.
Yeah, for sure. It eventually will lead you somewhere, but it might not be where we think. Specifically with just being open to the idea that you might be wrong.
Yeah. I think that's huge.
It is huge.
It's great.
It's a major thing. And so, it takes a lot to be able to admit that. I've been wrong before.
Yes.
Gosh. And it's hard to admit it whenever you are. Gosh. I've specifically, I've got a specific chore that I hate doing.
Yeah.
I don't really enjoy doing it. And it's just silly. It's doing the dishes. I don't like doing that.
Yeah.
You got to do it though, because when I was in college, the dishes would just build and build and build. And then it takes,
twice as long to do it.
Long. It stinks. It smells.
Everything's stuck on it.
Yes. And every now and then I still catch myself not doing some of the things that I should do. We have coffee mugs and whatnot, I think that I'll leave them in the sink from now on, time and time again. But I was wrong. To do that is not a correct way of living, because it doesn't have any discipline or austerity. And clearly that's needed, that's necessary. It provides structure, and, just because, it's not the most important thing that you're going to do during the day doesn't mean it's not important.
Right. I agree. Yeah. And I do. My big thing is, I remember when we were doing our experiments through grad school and all this stuff, and everybody, you come up with your hypothesis and you're hoping that your experiment supports your hypothesis. And that's really what everybody wants to do. And I would hear about people, they were like, make sure you do not adjust the data to make your hypothesis true. And for me, it just never made sense to do that, because I think having a null hypothesis, so basically saying that yours is wrong, is just as informative as it's saying it's right. Because now you just have one more thing that that is not the answer.
Right.
And I think that's kind of this whole idea with critical thinking is you, through experience, through the things you do, you get to try it out. And if it's not the right way, that's okay, because now you've learned something. Now you know that's not the right way. But instead of just saying, wait, that is the right way, and keep going with it, even though you've found different alternatives, then I think that's where learning stops. And it becomes all about confirmation bias, and that you aren't listening to the other side. You aren't like bringing in new information to make an more informed decision. You're not listening to what's really happening. You're only listening to what you want to hear.
Right.
And I think that's what social media sometimes does. And I think that's what's happening in the news. I think it's what happens with different media outlets.
We talked about it with sociopathy. That's what, and that kind of the same deal where you're kind of constructing your
own reality.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. And then just abiding by the morals of that reality rather than the morals of like the one that people around you also have a voice in.
Right. Exactly. Yes. And that's the point. But it happens. And I think it's really kind of a scary thing that maybe that social media and the way that we function in our media world now with journalism, like, I don't feel like it's the same thing. That's why I don't call them journalists. I don't feel like they're doing there are some, I'm not saying everybody. So journalists out there, I think you're amazing, because you do critically think. But I think a lot of times with this, the clickbait, the getting the information out as soon as possible, maybe aren't the full, taking on the full journalism process. They're not looking at all the things that go into it to make sure that it is right, instead of just making sure you get the scoop. Right. And so I think that's a little nerve wracking, which then makes it just kind of reinforces certain behaviors of certain people. And then, we're left with what we have.
Yeah. And there's some malice in it too. Like it's not like overt malice where they're looking, but it's a more subtle form of it. Maybe even in some ways, I am arguably like even worse than when you immediately know what somebody's intentions are. Because there's a certain component to it, specifically like around, like an example of it would be shorting a stock, right? Or something like that, where you're kind of like just undermining, creating little seeds of doubt here and there, and then shortly capitalizing on it. A slow, long-term character assassination is, I think, more evil than just an immediate attack.
Yeah, it's kind of like the idea of being physically aggressive and then passive aggressive.
Right.
And we talk about like passive aggressive, just slowly, like, and then finally it's like, oh, what just happened? Where am I? And how did I get here? Right. Kind of thing. Have you seen Gladiator 2?
I have not seen it yet. I need to go see it.
You do. You don't even have to go see it. You can see it on Prime now. It's free. Okay. So you need to watch it, but there is this idea in there, right? Denzel Washington's in this one.
Oh, well,
and
gotta see it. I'll have to see it tonight.
I can't tell you. I'm not going to tell you what happens because I don't want to ruin it. So maybe we can talk about it later. But I feel like he is this guy, right? He's everybody's friend. He's everybody's, I'm in it for you. I'm in it for you. And I mean, it's not like he doesn't deliver, but there's always something in there too that is like the background that happens with it. So you'll have to see it. I don't want to tell you too much. Okay. Hopefully you'll remember this conversation. We'll be like, yeah, I see what she's talking about. But if I tell you, then it won't be as good. So.
Right. And it's different. Like there's different situations make sense. Make it different. Like the appeal of it different. You were talking about a journalist a second ago.
Yeah.
And my example happened to be shorting a stock.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you know how certain things are done, you do kind of have an innate advantage when the competition begins with. And when I say competition, I mean a competition of images.
Sure. I
mean, which is kind of like this may not be correct. The term phantasmagoria, where there's like sequence of images where
I kind of like that
and
word.
They're meant to, right. It's a
great word.
It's a nice big word. So,
it is.
But it's like a sequence of images that are kind of eliciting or trying to get an emotional reaction of some sort they're really scary.
Okay.
I mean, I think that one specifically has to do with scariness, but it's kind of like that. There's a competition of multiple sequences going on at the same time, competing for people's attention. There's nothing overtly wrong about that.
Right.
And having a business model around it, there's nothing overtly wrong about that. And I mean, you get to the third degree of that, which is, well, how do you choose how do you choose what it is that I'm going to make a part of my life, right? And there's nothing overtly wrong with that. Because, it's kind of like with the Walt White problem that we've talked about in the past, you're always doing it for the right reasons, no matter what.
Even if it's a bad thing.
If it's a bad thing, yeah. And so you get down to like that fourth degree and you're kind of like, okay, well, if this is not wrong and this is not wrong and this is not wrong, well, it seems like there's a lot of logic and maybe assuming that this next thing is not going to be wrong. Mm-hmm. But to some extent, I think there is an element of that in our information.
Yeah.
That's all I'm trying to say. And that's
agree.
There's nothing overtly wrong, again, with having somebody want to compete to have the very best story as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. In fact, and I would say that the business model complements that and probably confirms it, and saying that because we want to get the rewards for breaking the story and to having the scoop. Sometimes, specifically in a democracy, when you're thinking about not as a capitalistic society, but as an informed electorate, it pays dividends over a really long time to have good information and to be built on solid foundation. This morning, one of the things that we were asked to reflect on was a conversation, about what the truth, what is truth, in some ways it's a lot of things, but I mean, it's also kind of hard to discern sometimes in the moment. It's partially a feeling. We were mentioning the emotion, like how important it is to pay attention to your emotions. And to not, we use the term manipulate in the world of the defense side of that stuff. That term was popularized by a guy named Thomas Schelling, who's a strategist, like a arms strategist, basically, but an economist. And what he always talked about was, you want to manipulate risk, not because you're trying to manipulate people, but because you're trying to manipulate the situation to where bad things are less likely to happen.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that bad things aren't going to happen. Yeah. But you're just trying to bring the threshold for it down so that when it does happen, it's less. That's good.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So 100%. That's the purpose of life, isn't it? Right. To mitigate risk, to keep it from, but at the same time, we feel like the people who are, getting ahead are big risk, big reward. Right. And so sometimes, getting that scoop in the story or breaking news before we know everything is, it does end up being beneficial. Like you got it first. So now everybody's going to watch you because you or read your paper or do that because you were the one who came out with it first. And you seem to get the information. You have the insides, the inside somewhere, wherever. I don't know how you do it, but you're the one. Right. But then we find out, oh, wait, it wasn't right.
It wasn't correct.
Right. And so
Analysis,
all of a sudden, right. But if you don't report it, somebody else is. And then what if it was right? And, it's kind of like those, again, looking at the risk. Again, big risk, big rewards. But, if we can keep the risk at a minimum, then we will still have rewards. It just won't be where we were before. Right? We can have that stability. And maybe that's where we see in our news outlets, right? We have certain that, the new people, the podcast, not podcast maybe, but the vloggers, anybody else, right? They just say the stuff and because they've heard it and then they haven't necessarily looked at it. Well, maybe that was that story. That was the breaking story and you got it first. So that might be your point. But now that if you're associated with the bigger, has a reputable and prestige, then all of a sudden you can't do that.
The risk is too much.
Right. And so, and that's what I think it comes down to. So I don't know. Again, I think it's very, very important to understand that sometimes the information that's presented to you is not the whole story.
Right.
I think that I feel like that's part of my job is to make sure that we make sure that everybody understands that there are multiple perspectives and multiple points of views and multiple opinions for everything. Right. And that sometimes just because that's the way it's always been doesn't mean that's the way it should always be. Right. And that's what allows our students to develop that ability to critically think and make up for their own mind. I don't want to walk into class and tell you what to do. I don't want to tell you what the right answer is, but I do want to provide information so that you can critically think for yourself and decide what that answer is.
Right. Yeah. And this, to stay in that same vein, DeepSeek, this Chinese upstart is, on the other hand, like if they've got innovations, we need to be able to build off of them.
Yeah.
So it's so important for us to be able to take the model, learn from it, but we don't want to overstate it, which I think is the real issue there in the things that we discuss. We overstate things because they're entertaining, as we visited last week. They are entertaining. Yeah, it leads to more engagement. That doesn't necessarily lead to more fruitful outcomes, especially in a constitutional republic. But there's also another side of that story, which is that there's also a competition going on for allies and partners. And that story might have been in there as propaganda, sure, but also as a strategy, a long-term strategy to remind people that, remember, we're the ones that are favorable to people. We're the ordinary people. We're not billionaires.
Yeah.
If you look over there, look, who is it that's in line to benefit from this stuff? They're the wealthiest of the wealthiest, and that's not us. We're, and that's what makes communism,
right,
or something along those lines. And I know that that's not the only thing that makes communism, and that's the whole point. But certainly a big part of communism is not believing in private property, which is really disharmonious with America.
Yeah.
It makes it difficult to compete, but it shows also the challenges, I suppose, of finding good information, evaluating it, trying to assess it, get it back out in a processed way or whatever, and also bring it some added value as well, that it was built on experience from the time that you got the information to the time that you're able to try to understand it. I hope that that's part of the search for truth. And we try to talk a little bit about, and we have 8-week classes.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a challenge to work everything in, and we really don't have time to do too much of it even, but we try to do simulations in our courses on days that we think that it makes sense. We did a budget appropriation process a couple of weeks ago, and it had to do majorly with this issue of not getting everything that you want, needing to compromise, being a team player, and that's a major thing. You're an old volleyball player, or a young volleyball player, I should say. And I mean,
no, I am
being
old.
on a team. Yeah, no, being on a team and understanding there's a time for you and a time for the team. And
absolutely. And that's that makes you the best team, is when it's not just about the individual. Like, you can have a bunch of great individual players and they're on a team, but if they don't play as a team, it doesn't matter. Right. I love my little team, and I do say little team because when we go against to play everybody else, we're teeny tiny. But the difference is I think that I've really tried to get them to work together and realize, what are your strengths and what can you do? And we don't need to necessarily be the tallest. Does it help? Oh my gosh, yes, it does help. Yes, but oh gosh, it helps. Like,
I've played volleyball maybe an aggregate of not very many times.
It helps, just little things, like just telling where to play defense. If I had a block, it'd be a different story. But now defense, I'm like, you just have to go everywhere. You don't have a certain place because they're just not tall enough. Everybody's hitting over us, so it's difficult. But that's not the point. The point is yes, when they can work together, they're so much better. Now, individually, are they good? Yes, but it makes them even better because they can work as a team. And I think anybody with that, right?
But band,
I
mean, although I'm sure, no doubt, part of those things like band, like high school band that would play together in the 1920s.
Yeah.
To people dancing and jazz swinging or whatever that was called. A band, like a rock and roll band. And sometimes it's fun to think about these different layers of accountability and separation of powers is kind of built in naturally to just about everything that we experience in our natural lives. But that's a good example would be, if I'm a guitar player, hypothetically, if I'm a guitar player, which I am, and if I like really loud guitar, which I do, and I like it to be kind of distorted, and I do, then maybe there's a situation where I am in a volume contest with our lead singer, right, who is also trying to crank their volume up, right? understandably, because they can't hear themselves in the monitor. They can't hear themselves out there because I'm sitting there trying to make it about the guitar, which is super cool. But it's only cool when it's with the other band members.
Yeah.
It's only when it's like that it's, I mean, you can forget, especially when you're on stage, that, there is a bigger picture sometimes, that is kind of, just not being paid attention to, because those people you can't even hear them.
Yeah.
And you can't hear yourself necessarily out there. The monitor mix is sometimes different than the mix that you get outside of it. And I think that also plays a pretty big role. We visit about this in our experiences in the community college, and has to do with being siloed, sort of, only hearing certain, specific certain things, which by the way, I love our hallway. Yeah. And I love the people we work with. That's part of doing, I think, what makes it fun to be able to visit, is having common interests and common values.
Yeah.
If you were to take people and mix them up from other categories, I'm not saying it wouldn't be wrong. It wouldn't be social sciences.
Right. Absolutely.
Right? It would be a social science. The community of that field would no longer would cease to function the original purpose that it had.
Yeah, I agree. And we do see that right when we go to these meetings and they're like, you can't sit with your people.
Right.
And so you don't. And which then sometimes when you do, you actually learn a lot about different things.
Sure.
Right now, does it necessarily feel comfortable all the time? No. And do we prefer to sit with the people that we know and that yes. Right. And that's human nature. Right. But what we try to do is try to make people, hey, step out just for a minute, just so you can see something else. And a lot of times we all grunt and, oh God, nobody wants to sit. I don't know those people. And the truth is, a lot of times you do find people who are like you in a lot of different places. I agree with you. I love our hall. I always joke and say that we should just probably do a sitcom on our hall, because it's very interesting, and I think it would work. I think we could have a sitcom and people would watch it.
Right.
Maybe not, but I think it would be fun.
I'd watch it. I mean, we could,
yeah, I would too.
This kind of thing. I mean, but by the same token, it's not like the, do you remember the show? Of course you remember the show, The Office, which is a great,
it is. American, it's hilarious.
Good old.
And you know what? I haven't seen all of it, which is funny. Just random. Wow. Yeah. Okay. I just watch random episodes. You know what? That's what you got to do sometimes. Yeah. I wasn't the follower of everything, but.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of like Friends. That's the really big one I guess when it got to about the third season, I couldn't watch it anymore because it became about Ross and Rachel, really. Yeah. I mean, that was really what they were doing with that. They almost all nonstop, and they were breaking up and they were getting together, and they were breaking up and they were getting together. Yeah. And there just kind of ceased to be more of a storyline because now they've grown up. It's like, and it shows kind of the static maybe nature of how people think, like, this is the most dynamic part of my life. Yeah. And you know what? I'm going to get into the 30s and that's over. It's just all that part is just over. Now it's just going to be, now it's just about this other thing, and forget that the whole thing is the growth. Yeah. I have one of my former supervisors and guys that I really respect said that once said that when you cease growing, you might as well be dead. And I thought, you know what, that's a pretty good comment. That's very accurate, because I mean, if you listen to like the Shawshank Redemption and some of the common wisdom that's part of that great movie, get busy living or get busy dying. Yeah. And I mean, if you think about it in the terms of Ross and Rachel, and only capture that 20s, we're living together, there's lots of dynamism and lots of all these other things that are happening, and now things are just going to slow down. We're moving out of the city. We're going to go and try to have just a ton of stability. Of course, that it doesn't change anything about the reality of the situation if you're thinking about it and trying to evaluate it, not just on a day-to-day regimented, scheduled, and probably highly structured environment like that you're trying to provide now. The difference is that you're not just responsible for yourself. Yeah. And that's disconcerting. I think that there's a certain level of convolutedness involved with not accepting the need for structure and the need for austerity.
Yeah.
So I think that it would behoove us to think about Ross and Rachel as happy and dynamic as they move forward.
Yeah.
And not just in that one. But The Office is the same way. What I love about The Office is they do it, but they're already grown-ups.
Yeah.
You know?
Well,
for the most part. I mean, I say that. That's a relative. Yeah. That's a very relative grown-up.
It's funny. And I do like how they do it because, there are certain things that you're like, oh my gosh, that is exactly what happens. Right. And people don't even realize it.
Yeah, exactly.
But, we could talk about shows and things all the time. And I think it would. They should do something. So if anybody's out there want to propose a write up for, I don't know, community college, behavioral science department. I don't know what.
Yeah.
Social behavior sciences, my bad.
Yeah, for sure. And make sure you subscribe. Click subscribe and make sure you get into it. I don't think anybody's trying to censor anything. I saw on a show once that said, they're trying to censor you. So click subscribe so that you don't get stopped along the way or whatever. That's not what's happening here.
No.
I mean, we're not. We would like it if you subscribe because we are trying to make content available weekly so that you are, are staying up to date on what's going on.
And absolutely.
Hopefully there's value that's attached to it.
Yes, so that's the big thing.
Anyway, thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody. Critically think out there.
Y'all take care. Bye-bye.